I have to remind myself that when I point this, I'm going to end up doing this a lot and pointing at that screen. And you'll not see that, so that won't do you any good at all. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning and a chance to talk about this. I'm hoping this works. So far, yes, it does work. I see it now. It is working. So I appreciate this opportunity and to talk about our work in Scotland. I don't know if you've ever been to Scotland. I'm guessing there's a bit of a Scottish influence here. I've met some Taggarts, I've met a Williamson, I've met a Keith, I've met a few others, and there's a good few Scots names kicking about. So I'm guessing that there are some good-looking, intelligent people in this congregation. We appreciate that, but hopefully we can tell you a little bit about it. Scotland, to kind of give you a geographical insight into it, you're looking at it north to south, east to west, top to bottom, left to right, that kind of thing, right to left, whatever. And if you were to take Scotland from the north, and there's two screens, so sometimes you'll have to look at the one I'm looking at. So, you can just see it. The north coast, and this is the border with England. We don't talk about them. But anyway, if you were to take Scotland and move it and just drop it right into Alabama, then it would fit perfectly north to south. Now, the islands would stretch right up into Kentucky in the north, and they would stretch out towards Mississippi in the west. The sad thing is, if you're an Auburn fan, you'd be underwater if this was Scotland. But I choose Alabama for this illustration rather than Georgia because that would mean England is in the Gulf of Mexico. And that seems like a pretty good deal for me. I don't know how we feel about that. The thing about Scotland is, and I'm sure Richard will testify to this if you were to ask him, is that Scotland is very mountainous. We call this area the Northwest Highlands. These are the Grampian Highlands. These are the southern uplands, which are also mountainous. And Scotland itself, as far as population is concerned, is largely confined to this area and then up the coast. There are about 5.25 million people in Scotland. I'm not sure. I guess that kind of compares to Alabama. So you have a lot of understanding of it. I live just outside Glasgow, which is the largest city. You can see, hopefully, it was working there. It is, Cumbernauld. And my mother lives over here just outside Edinburgh on the other side of the country. That's a good 30-minute drive to get from one side of the country to the other. So, or going to the 7-Eleven in rush hour, as we might say here. But that gives you an idea. Now, the interesting thing is that about half of everyone who is Scottish lives in Glasgow or the immediate area around it. I'm from Cumbernauld. I grew up in East Kilbride, and that's where Richard worked when he lived in Scotland, I guess about 10 or so, 10 plus, less than that, whatever, years ago. And during that time, the area started to grow. And we've had a little bit of growth numerically. It's the first time in over a generation that there's been any numerical growth in the country. 5.25 million people, half of them within an hour's drive of our church building. And a lot of them a lot closer than that. And Cumbernauld puts itself very much at the hub of everything that's going on in Scotland. It's in the heart of the country. It is on the corner of just about every major road network in the country. If you're going abroad and you're going to an airport, you're going to drive probably past Cumbernauld. And if you want to go and see our beautiful Highlands, you're going to drive past Cumbernauld. So it is a fantastic location in terms of those kind of logistics and transport, communications and things of that nature. The church has been in Scotland since 1783. So it's been around for, 236 years, around about the same time that America celebrated its second birthday as an independent nation. If you go from 1781, when the Revolutionary War ended. I say that because Alexander Campbell came to this country around about 1808, 1809. He met up with guys, got to know guys like Barton W. Stone. And listen, if you want to know anything about Restoration history, speak to Richard's dad. He even writes books about it. So he's the guy you need to speak to about that. Campbell eventually came to Scotland in the 1840s, 1848, 49, and was greatly encouraged to find brethren there. I mention it for this reason. You're talking about an age when there was no Facebook, no Twitter, no internet, The ability to communicate was really on the idea of you got on a ship and you spent 3 months sailing across the ocean or however long it took. And yet, brethren in the United States and brethren in the United Kingdom who were studying their Bible independently of each other came to the same conclusion as to what the Bible teaches about the church and how we become a Christian and how we ought to worship God. That is a remarkable testament. Now, there is a trend in Scotland, there certainly used to be, I guess it's dying off now, that people would talk about the Church of Christ and say, that's one of those American churches. Well, you'd have to sort of give them a little history lesson. There's evidence of the gospel coming into Scotland probably about 17 or 1800 years ago, during the days of the Roman Empire. And I think that proves that when people have this great relationship with God that He offers to us, and we're willing to serve and we're willing to go like the gospel teaches, there's no stopping it. It will spread. It will get everywhere that it possibly can. So that gives you a little bit of the geography of it. Unlike yourselves, we are still under the rule of England. And like yourselves, we yearn for our independence. But that's okay, we'll figure something out. This is my family. Our oldest son doesn't like getting photographed, so he wouldn't come. But these are our children. For the young men, I see there's some young men here. I regret to inform you that these girls are currently involved in other young men's lives. But young girls, that boy there is now 16 years old. And if you want to know more about him, see me afterwards. We can talk. That's my wife, Beth, as well. And Beth and I have been married now just coming up for 24 years. To those of you who are married, whether it's been for 2 years or 40 years, never forget how long you've been married. You're allowed to forget your anniversary once. I'm still holding on to that. I haven't forgotten it yet. I'm using that, and I hope I never do forget, but I'm very blessed to have her in our lives. Our daughter Megan is active in the church. Our daughter Bethany has fallen away because she moved away from the home and decided she didn't want to go to church anymore, but we're optimistic that she's going to come back. And Megan is hoping to go and work with the Gospel Broadcasting Network next year for the summer. Kind of what Richard did. Richard came to Scotland and stayed in our home in 2005. Richard at the time, when I first met Richard, he was 12 years old. And he was still the same height when I met him when he was 17 years old. And when I met him at Freed-Hardman University, he was a part-time firefighter. That's when he wasn't allowed a beard and he had to shave that off. And when he came to stay with us, I said, hey, you know what would be great, Richard? So we tried child-proofing our house, but they kept getting back in. So we said, Richard, as a fireman, if there were a fire, I want you to tell us what we need to do. Let's get the family together, and we'll talk about it. And Richard said, yeah, that'd be great. I'll show you how to escape from a burning house. Well, the morning he was going to do it, our oldest son locked us into our bedrooms. He tied both our doors together, and neither of us could get out. I says, we should have done this yesterday so we know how to get out the window, but there you go. That's our oldest son for you. This is our congregation in Cumbernauld, most of them. And we have the oldest member of the church is Mary Anderson, and that's this lady here. She is currently 94 years old, and she was baptized last year. Now, when you go to Luke chapter 18 and you go into Luke chapter 19, at the very end of chapter 18, you'll read the story of a man called Bartimaeus. His name's given, I think it's in the Gospel of Mark. And he cries out to Jesus to be saved. And Jesus asks him what he wants. He says, give me my sight back. And he does. He gives him back his eyesight. But also talks about his salvation. You know, the faith has brought you your salvation, he says to him. I wonder how many times Jesus had seen Bartimaeus. I wonder how many times Bartimaeus had heard Jesus. And Jesus in the last week of his life, and he's just told his disciples he's in the last week of the life, I wonder how many conversations they had shared as he went through Jericho. 3 times a year he was required to appear before the Lord in Jerusalem. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And I wonder, as a child going up there, he might have seen this old beggar and taken him some bread, or remembered the beggar from when they'd been there the previous year and took some extra things to help him, and spoke to him about God, because when he was in the temple at 12, the leaders were amazed at his understanding of the Scriptures. A conversation is not necessarily a once-in-a-lifetime event. It can be, but sometimes it's a conversation that is repeated over and over and over again. There's a little woman there. We tease her a lot, but she's a wonderful woman. That's Karen Barr. And we've known Karen for over 20 years. And Karen wouldn't come to church. She was a Sunday school teacher for the Presbyterians. We call it the Church of Scotland. And her children came to her youth work. I'll introduce you to some of our young people in a minute. And they came along and they enjoyed the classes and the clubs and the youth activities. They went away with us for weekends. And we would go and visit them in their house, and we talked to Karen and her husband, and no interest. No, I've got my own church. I go to the Church of Scotland, and that's what I do. Then she had a miscarriage. She lost a baby. And we went to visit her because their children had told us, and we tried to help her and comfort her during a very difficult time in her life. And she fell out with the Church of Scotland because nobody came to visit her. But still, we couldn't talk to her about coming to church, but she quit the kirk. But then her father, she was an only child, her father took ill. He had a heart attack. And Robert was taken into the hospital. Now, Karen's about that height, not very tall. And her dad was about that height. Kind of a Scottish thing, not enough vegetables, I guess. But it was when we went to visit her dad that suddenly she was interested in who we were as Christians. And a couple of years ago, she and her husband were baptized. But it's a conversation that took 20 years. And I think that's the case with men like Bartimaeus and Zacchaeus and the man at the pool of Siloam and others like them in various places where Jesus brought people to the Lord, reintroduced them to the God that they thought they knew from the Jewish leaders, but were now seeing in a completely different light. And I think we need, whether we're in Scotland, Alabama, or Ghana, or wherever, I think we do need to appreciate that God doesn't always expect us to draw 3,000 in when we first preach the gospel. Sometimes that seed needs to germinate and grow and cultivate. My friend Adam graduated from Lipscomb in 1987. And during the years that he was there in Sparta, he lived in Sparta during the breaks and the holidays, the vacation time and things. And it was a farming family. And they said to him one day, Adam, I want you to help me clear a few acres. Great, what are we going to do? So we're going to clear it out, we're going to get rid of everything, we're going to cultivate the land, and we're going to plant something in there. So he spent a good part of the summer clearing up those fields, several acres. And when they were ready, he said, right, now we're going to plant. What are we going to plant? He says, walnuts. We're going to plant walnuts. I love walnuts. You used to have this thing called a walnut whip. A little walnut on top of chocolate. I mean, that's the perfect combination right there. But anyway, at the end of the summer, he says to the farmer, oh, I can't wait till next year when we have some of those walnuts. Now, I don't know what you know about walnuts, but the farmer said to him, he said, Adam, I might not be alive when these walnuts are ready to eat. It takes 30 years. Sometimes that's how long a conversation can go on with a neighbor, a colleague, a family member, a spouse. And God has given us instruction, whether it's in 1 Peter 3 or in other epistles, about how to conduct our lives so that those in the world can see and hear what it means to be a Christian. Well, that's important in Scotland. It's a society that is very jaded about religion. Protestant and Catholic, we don't really have I've got to be frank, we don't really have a problem back home with the color of a person's skin. But boy, do we have a problem, or certainly had a major problem a few years ago, with what church you went to. If you were a Protestant or a Catholic, that was the defining moment of your life and would affect the career that you could have and everything else, the school you would go to and the education opportunities. Stories told of a young Jewish boy who's walking through Glasgow. And he gets attacked by a gang. And the gang are beating him up because they think that he's from the other side of the sectarian divide. And he says, "Why are you attacking me? I'm a Jewish boy." And they stop. And they think. And then they say to him, "But are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic Jew?" Well, such is the mind of the small-minded, I guess, amongst us. This is the youth group in Perth. And I'm going to introduce you to Scott in a minute. Perth was a work we started about 5 years ago. And we were doing a coffee shop study. Jack Strachan, who passed away last year, was there. And during that time, a study that we had together in the Starbucks of all places. I don't know how we could afford it, but we managed. And Jack was talking about the church. And a woman stopped and she came over and she said, "Did you see the Church of Christ?" And he said, "Well, yes, I preach for the Church of Christ down in Cumbernauld." And she said, "I'm a member of the church. I was baptized in Perth 30 years ago. And I've been worshipping all by myself for 25 years, roughly." Well, we're coming back to plant the church. And we did that later that year. And a couple of years later, a young man moved there to become the preacher for that particular congregation. Last year, he was over here. And we went up and took the opportunity to work with the kids. When he started the youth club, they only had nobody in the group. They'd open it up, and it was just him and a couple of young girls and guys that had gone up to help him. And after a few weeks, eventually a wee kid popped his head round the door. "What's going on in here?" "Oh, we're having a youth club." "Where's the youth?" "Well, you're the youth. Come back next week. Bring all your friends." And he did, and now there's nearly 40 of them. So you've got to put yourself in the position for others to come towards you. You know, we'll often pray. I'll get on to things, and I'll get on to people, and young people will say to me, "Oh, I'm looking for a Christian." Yeah, these are very young people, so don't be there just yet. But, you know, they'll say things like, "Oh, when am I going to find a Christian to marry?" And I'll say, "Well, when are you going to go out and find them?" You know, you don't catch fish by sitting in the house and watching the fishing channel on cable. You got to go out and do it. You know, you don't open up the fridge and say, or the refrigerator, and you say, "Where's the milk?" Well, you know, sometimes you have to go and buy the milk. You have to bring it back. You have to put yourself in a position where you're going to find that person. She's loving it down here at the front, I'm telling you, man. She's thinking, "Oh, man, this is good advice, I'll tell you." But anyway, and so, you know, that's what I say to young folk. You want to find somebody, you're going to have to go out there, and you're going to have to show themselves. My friend Kevin, I don't know if you knew Kevin, but Kevin went to everything. He was like me. We were kind of keen to find a Christian mate, and we both did eventually. In my case, it was love at first sight. In his case, she just felt sorry for him, I think. But he went to absolutely everything. Folk, if you've got an opportunity to be with members of the church, take it. Because you've got a congregation here of how many, Richard? 400, give or take? Okay, we've got a nationwide congregation, if you will, of about 700 or 800. That's in the whole country. So you've got to get out and meet other people. If you want a good fellowship with other Christians, you've got to spend time with other Christians. And I tell you, there's nothing more valuable, nothing you appreciate more than finding other Christians when you live in a desert of faith and when there's so few who care at all about God. This is Scott down the front here. This has stopped working again. Anyway, that's him with the giant face at the front there. He used to be a model for Where's Wally, but he moved on into preaching. Some of the other guys there, the guy behind him with the beard, if you've got younger ladies here, he's single. So if you'd like to see me afterwards, I can introduce you. And there's a guy on your, I always have to turn around, on the right. That's my friend Neil. Neil's, he's a gospel preacher, but he's not full-time. He works for the bank. He's a technician, an IT guy. But he works with the local congregations, where he's grown up, and another one that they've planted in Falkirk just about 7 years ago. And a great gospel preacher, tremendous gospel preacher, and his son's in front of him, and he's a great gospel preacher. He preached for us this year. We had in fact, I'll tell you about that in just a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. These are our ladies. Where would we be, gentlemen, without our ladies? And I'm talking about those of us who serve within the church, not just within our families. You know, there's so much work that goes on that we never really get to see. So much teaching that goes on that affects so many different lives. So Mother's Day this year, this was the opportunity to honor them. And some of the guys in the church like to spoil them a wee bit on Mother's Day. Our Mother's Day is in March. And our Father's Day, I think, is the same as yours. It's in June, is that right? I think it's in June. But our Mother's Day is in March. And I used to say to Mum, my own mother, says, when's Mother's Day? And she always told me it was 9 months after Father's Day. And that's all I have to say about that. You learn some things on that. And this is our daughter, Megan. And we spend a lot of time in the lives of other young people. This is a little girl who comes to our Tuesday club. She came to camp this year. She fell in love with Megan. Megan has got a wonderful spirit when it comes to working with children. Both her daughters do. They're very good when it comes to working with others. And we have 3 widows in the congregation. The one at the front, you know Mary, but the other one is my mother. And she's not a member of the church. None of my family are a member of the church except my wife and her children. And my mother now has Alzheimer's and has gone into a nursing home just before I came over here for this particular visit. But I took the widows out for the day. The woman on, I always have to turn around. The woman on the left is Maureen. Her husband Jack was the chap who taught me the gospel and baptized me. And he passed away 18 months ago. A great loss to the church, but a tremendous servant and a great preacher. So I took them out, I spoiled them that day. My mum wasn't able to go with us, so we popped in and visited with her for a little while, had a cup of tea, and those kind of things that we do. We prefer our tea in a cup, not in a harbour, so we enjoy it that way. We have a very diverse congregation. We have members of the church worshipping with us from the Philippines, Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, Gambia, Trinidad and Tobago, Poland. We even have an American. He's a Yankee. You gotta love. And we also have an English woman that's now attending with us. She's not a member of the church, but she's just started worshipping with us. And we're building that relationship and we're teaching her the truth, and I think she'll come to understand it. I want to point out Paulina. Paulina is, I'll have to say, she's the white woman there. She's Polish. And she and her family live in a town called Kilmarnock, which is about a 2-hour bus ride to church. And they used to make that journey every week. So they'd wait for the bus, they'd get on the bus, that would bring them to the city. They'd wait for another bus, they'd get in the bus, and they'd come out to the church. And they did this every Sunday. They've recently, in the last year, purchased a car. And so it's cut the journey time down to about 45 or 50 minutes. But very faithful. Her husband, his father just died suddenly, either yesterday or Friday. So please do keep Adam in your prayers. Adam Mendy is his name. And very, very shocked to hear of his father's passing back in Gambia, which is in West Africa. The lady on your left, I guess I just got to keep. Yeah, well, I'm looking at the same as you. I should know. I'm thinking it's something else. Anyway, right. The lady on the left, Nicola. That's Jack's oldest daughter. Nicola, very faithful Christian, grown up in the church. She's one of the rare ones in the churches in Scotland because she's always been in the church. She was born into it. She grew up in it. She's faithful in it. She's raised her family to be in it. But none of her children are faithful. She got 2 sons. One never obeyed, and one's no longer faithful. But her husband cheated on her and left her. And after some counseling and so on and so forth, she wanted to take him back. He wanted to come back. She was willing to forgive him. Good Christian woman. Very difficult thing to do, though. Great admiration for her willing to do that. And he said he would come back, but only if she left the church. And she said, well, I'm not leaving the church. So that's the deal breaker. She's still faithful. She never reconciled. She has the right to remarry. And this young man is Paulo, one of our Filipino guys, a great servant in the Lord, just in his mid-20s. And Paulo wants to be a gospel preacher. And we don't want to send him to America. We didn't want to send Scott to America to study at a school because, when these young guys come over from Scotland, and they're, all Scotsmen are good looking. They're all very attractive to the young ladies. And the next thing you know, they've got themselves a lovely young Southern belle, and they stay here in America, and it's a great loss to the church. It's happened more than you realize. And we started training them in-house. We have a program called Applied Preacher Training. We use the World Video Bible School. And Paolo spends time studying. He's a full-time chef, so he's got a very busy schedule. He does youth work. He teaches adult classes, teenage classes, youth classes, works with a youth group. He'll visit people. He does basically the work of a minister while he's in training, while he's learning the Bible. So while I went to the Florida School of Preaching, and while it's a great benefit to study that intensively for 2 years, or to go to somewhere like Freed-Hardeman or Faulkner universities and have that opportunity, you tend to be kind of kept away from what's happening in the real world. And when you come back, your friends have moved on, they've married, they've got other careers. The world has changed. 1989, I came to America, and you had the Soviet Union. You'll have to ask your parents what the Soviet Union is, children. You had the Berlin Wall, and you had Margaret Thatcher. And I'm not saying which one was the worst of those three when I was growing up. But when I came home in 1991, there was no Soviet Union, no Berlin Wall, and no Margaret Thatcher. The world changed, and I didn't even notice. So we do this thing in-house, plus it keeps them active within the church, where we are, which gives us an additional resource for the work that we're doing. And one of those works is just simply taking the gospel elsewhere. About 7 or 8 years ago, a church was planted in Falkirk. There hadn't been one there since just after World War II. We've now planted a church in Perth. There hadn't been one there since around about 1992. And we're in the process, we've started another study in a little town in Airdrie, which is about 20 minutes from where I live. And there hasn't been a church there for over 70 years either. I think it's closer to 80 or 90 years, I believe. The disciples of Christ had a huge influence in the churches in Great Britain and Ireland. And sadly, a lot of the digressions of the disciples came into the church and tore the congregations apart over the years. Appreciate the truth and defend it vigorously from the pulpit and in your own homes, because it's easy. If you're doing it right, the evil one is not happy. And if God is happy, the evil one is definitely not happy. So keep at it and stick with the truth, because otherwise digression always leads to worse things. David Lipscomb once said, when you open the door for one departure, it's open for 1,000. Brethren, that's just the way it is. I've seen it in Scotland. I've seen dozens upon dozens of churches disappear because they thought an instrument would be useful in worship. They thought that committees should be ruling over various churches because they thought the missionary society was a good idea. They voted themselves out of existence in 1980. They haven't been around in all those years. All because they started getting away from the truth. And yet the Lord's church continues just as Christ prophesied and promised, that the gates of Hades would not prevail against it. One of the things that we do is a thing called the Young Men of God Gospel Meetings. I came across this when we were in, I'm trying to advance that. I'll try again. There we go. We'll come back to it in a minute. I'll come back to the annual Men of God in just a minute. It's coming up. Back in June, we were invited by the community to organize a barbecue. And ladies, I don't know what it's like in your homes, but I guarantee you, if you say food and fire, the men will help with the cooking. And that's just the way it is for us. We like to see fire licking the meat as we cook it. And it's just a male thing. So they asked us if we would do a barbecue for the community, and there was other charitable groups, voluntary groups, and so on. Do you know what it's really about? A conversation. You know, when Jesus was out in the wilderness with the 5,000 on the banks of the Sea of Galilee, and he gave them bread and fish from what little rations they had. Do you know what he was really wanting? A conversation. You go to John 6 and you can read about that conversation. You can read about that realization that Jesus is the Son of God, the only one that has the words of life. Well, that's what we're trying to do. Raise the profile of the church, introduce ourselves to the community. We try and be involved with it and be as active as we can. and we had a lot of our congregation very involved in it. I'm guessing Wednesday night's your midweek Bible study? Right, well, back home, our midweek Bible study is Tuesday and Thursday. For this reason, Tuesday night we do all our youth work, and we do all our children's classes. And all our adults are doing that, so there's nobody for the adult class except the teacher. So on Thursday night, we have the adult class, so the adults can get fed as well. I tell you, it's a blessing to be part of a congregation where so many people want to be involved. I mentioned Mary Anderson to you, who's 94. She still goes to the little pensioners club across the road from where she lives and cooks lunch for them on a Wednesday. 94 years old, that's remarkable. I tell you, brethren, God is not finished with us until we receive the invitation to come home. And there's still something for each one of us to do. Well, we were busy that day. All the proceeds that we raised after we deducted our expenses, we gave to a little charitable group, because we're not in the business of taking money from the world to facilitate the work of the church. That's our work. John talks about that in one of his epistles, and that's the way that we prefer to do it. One of the things that I mentioned was an attempt to get the church in a little town called Airdrie. Now that couple there are called Basil and Yvonne Cass. And they are from a country called South Africa, yeah? Dit is how they talk down there. And Richard knows Basil and Yvonne very well, because he worked with them when he was in East Kilbride. They've opened up their home. They go to the church in Livingston, about 25 miles from where they live. And they've opened up their home, and they've invited friends that they have in the community who are learning the truth, who are hearing the gospel, who come from denominations, but are now hearing the way God wants us to be Christians and to serve Him. We're very grateful for them, and we pray that that work develops and becomes what it can. I mentioned the Young Men of God gospel meeting. Last year and this year we held 2 gospel meetings, and last year all the preachers were 20 years and younger. Brethren, where's our next generation of preachers going to come from? Well, take a look around you, you can see them. If they're younger than you, that's the next generation of leaders in our church. Where's the next generation of women who are going to lead in our congregations through our classes and the ladies' classes and the benevolence work and all the things that are done? Take a look around you. They're right in front of you. We have to encourage them to teach. And one of the great things that we've always done in Scotland is we've called on the men of the church to take up the mantle of leadership, to learn how to preach and teach, and not just rely on someone else to stand in the pulpit and tell us what to do. My friend Neil made a great point a number of years ago when he came. I don't know if you were there, Richard. I don't think you were. No, you couldn't have been. But he came down to a camp planning event that we had. We run a camp. It's in its 52nd, just had its 52nd year. And 53rd, actually. And he made the point that when Moses came down out of the mountain, he was glowing from being in the presence of God. And the people couldn't bear to look at it. So they asked him to wear a veil and tell them what God was saying. And he did. And God decided that that's it, the veil's going to be there for the rest of Judaism. And there it was in front of the Holy of Holies, and only one person was allowed into the presence of God one day in a year. Brethren, that veil was torn top to bottom. And if we are in the mentality of thinking of our preacher as more of a pastor, and the pulpit as the only source of authority for all matters of religion, we have forgotten what the name Church of Christ means. And we need to get back to the Bible and these basics. And so these young men are doing that, teaching and preaching the gospel and learning what it's going to mean. If I'm going to get a church planted 20 minutes away, I'm going to need some help for somebody to go there on Sundays when I'm here in America, for example, to preach. Well, I need these young guys to step up and do that. And a lot of congregations in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, I dare say, began because of what they called the circuit preachers. And an old preacher would drive up and he'd pick up half a dozen or a dozen boys, and he would drive around the county and he would drop each one off at a different building, and they'd preach the gospel and a church get planted. And that's why you can pick up a stone in Alabama or Tennessee and throw it, and there's another Church of Christ just down the road. Because we encourage others to do the job and preach the gospel. One of our young men is Ivan. Remember Ivan? Remember when he was this height? Richard remembers Ivan. He's from Ghana. You would never know it to talk to him. He sounds as Glasgow as I do. But he was preaching the gospel. He did a great lesson on the life of Joseph this year, and we were very encouraged by what he had to say. And there's exciting times in our congregation. 2 years ago, we finally bought some land. We've got a lot less of it than you all do. Let's just leave it at that. And it's the one thing nobody's making anymore, except in the Netherlands, I suppose. But we had found a plot of land. Our journey in this began about 14, 15 years ago. And we couldn't find anything. We were really struggling with it. We'd go to the county, we'd ask them, we'd find private owned land, we'd go and talk to them. And it was always working out about £300,000 an acre. And this was for land that nobody else wanted. We found this plot of land, 3 1/3 acres. We were excited. And we phoned up the guy who owned it, and we asked, would you be willing to sell an acre? And he said, well, are you willing to make me an offer? And we said, absolutely. He said, well, how much? And we said, 100,000. Well, after he finished laughing, he told us that that land is worth £3.5 million. That, at the time, was about $5 million. It works out at just over about £1 million an acre. That's how much land was selling for. The reason for it is it's right on the interstate. It's on the corner of the second busiest road in Scotland. And he thought it was worth that. Now, across the road on the other side, you can't see it, but it's behind the trees on the right there. But when you go over there, there are houses that have been built, private residences. That land sold for $7.5 million. This is prime real estate. Well, we said we couldn't afford it. They called us back and they offered us an acre for $670,000, about $1 million. So there you go. They were willing to partition a bit. We couldn't afford it. So now it was our turn to laugh at him. And we went back to the county and they told us, there is no land. There's not going to be any land. Don't ever come back. There's the door. There's the door. Don't let it hit you on the way out. And the guy had been really helpful, but he was just trying to tell us, look, this is a waste of our time and yours. Give up. You know, the devil does that. They walked out of the office, and a few days later, this is 3 years ago, the phone rings. And the guy said, would you be interested in buying it all? Well, how much? Well, put a 3 in front of the number, and we'll settle for that, 300,000. And we found out there was going to be tax on it. Then we found out there were little voles living on it. These are tiny little creatures that you hunt. You don't really hunt them, you just get rid of them. They're like, you know, pleasant-looking mice or something like that, I guess. You know, you know, put the traps out for them. When we found out, they said, oh, you might not be able to build in this land. So we went back to them and he said, oh, there's a good chunk of the land might not be usable because it's got these endangered and protected species on it. You might know how that goes, I dare say. So we got the land for £240,000 plus tax, which is 20%. We bought it for £288,000. And we're in the process of trying to develop it. This is not just a facility for the Church of Christ in Cumbernauld. I believe this is a facility for the churches of Christ in Scotland. We don't want to build a place of worship and teaching. We'll do that. You know, there'll be, like you all have, a hall for worship, classes for teaching, and, you know, fellowship and so on and so forth. That's the ambition that we have. But really what we want is a building that's open 7 days a week. A building where families can come and just enjoy downtime and playgroups and nurseries or whatever, where addicts can come and talk about their problems and really learn who the higher power is. Where groups can come and just be an encouragement to each other in their voluntary work and in their charitable work. And they're doing it in the shadow of the name Church of Christ. And they're doing it in the light of the gospel. They'll walk out and there'll be the gospel on the wall. There'll be tracts and brochures and videos playing, whatever it takes, to get a conversation started about what it means to be the church. It has to be much more than that. The architect has come up with some ideas as to what it might look like. This is it on the north side, the main entrance. This is it on the south side. And the part nearest to you on the right, those are the classrooms, the auditoriums in the middle. And the outreach centre is the one at the back. And that's the one that we want to make most available to the community, where young folk can come in off the street and kick a ball around, because that's what football really is. You get a ball, it's round, you kick it. That's why it's called football, you see. The other game's kind of like rugby, but that's another story. I've learned one thing: go easy on the football fans in America. This is what it hopefully will look like. And you know what? At the end of the day, it will be what God wants it to be. Because when you try and find a bit of land and you're told it costs $3.5 million, and God puts it in your lap for $250,000, God's got a plan for what we're doing in that area. And whatever we build on it, it will be what God has already decided. We just have to figure out how to get there and what it's going to be, and put ourselves out there and introduce ourselves to folk like yourselves and others when we're in the United States and in England and in Scotland and talking to other congregations. It will be something that says something about the glory of God. The second busiest road in Scotland, with that giant Pilate-like sign saying, "Follow Jesus, He is the way." Can you imagine that? And people going back to their communities and they hear the name Church of Christ and they're thinking, "Where have I heard that before?" On the way to the airport, on the way to the city, on the way back home. This is an incredible opportunity for all the congregations in Scotland. We're moving as a congregation towards being self-supporting. We have a great reputation. We've launched, and I don't just say that to boast or quickly in passing, but we are a working congregation. We have, Adam and I work full-time with the church and with Perth when we can. And of course, I'm trying to get a work going in Airdrie, and then there's all the youth work and everything else. We don't have elders, so sometimes we have to do the job of an elder. We don't have deacons, so sometimes we have to do the job of a deacon. We don't have a secretary, so sometimes we have to do the work of a secretary. We don't have a janitor. Sometimes we have to do the work of a janitor. We don't have a youth minister. Sometimes we do the work of a youth minister. I've got so many hats, I don't know what to do with them. I don't even know which one I've got on any given Sunday or day of the week for that matter. But we've also started an internet radio station in association with Truth FM, which is affiliated with the Gospel Broadcasting Network. And it is reaching people through the internet who are hearing the gospel 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's 100% British and Irish provided, which is great. You know, it overcomes some of the barriers and it allows the approach, because we best understand, I suppose, like you would. You wouldn't expect me to come to Alabama and understand. I really don't understand football or baseball. You know, I love them, don't get me wrong. But if somebody says, "Graham, can you explain American football?" Let me introduce you to Richard, he's American. Rugby, Richard, he's New Zealander. You know, you get the idea. David Livingstone was a missionary from Blantyre, which is a few miles from where I grew up, and he said, "Christ alone can save the world, but Christ cannot save the world alone. He needs us." He doesn't need the preacher, he does. But if we think that's the job of the preacher, we've missed what the gospel's about. When Paul says to Timothy, "Train up other men," he doesn't say to be preachers. He says, train up the men, train up the people of the congregation to keep teaching, preaching, and glorifying our God. That's our job. And brethren, nothing changes. It's still about souls. And there's a good work going on in Scotland. Thank you for what you've done to make it possible for us, for me to work full-time, for my family to be part of that. We love you. I'm glad I'm finally getting to meet all of you and to speak before you. I've known of brethren like Tim and Saul for a number of years. I even knew Jerry, albeit briefly. And his son Dale has stayed in our home. I've stayed in the home of his brother, and I've forgotten his name. What's his brother's name? Jeff Jenkins. I knew it began with G and I couldn't remember. And they're very dear to our family. This is a connection that we've had for a long time. And I'm grateful that it's very much a part of both our lives. Thank you, and God bless you.